The ground was so frozen they had to use a pickaxe before the shovel would bite. Clara Dawson stood at the edge of the hole and watched two neighbor men break the earth apart in chunks the color of iron. The sky was white. The wind came down from the Wind River Range, carrying the kind of cold that doesn't howl, but just settles into everything and stays. Her husband, Thomas, lay wrapped in a wool blanket on the tailgate of their wagon, his face covered, his boots still on, because Clara couldn't bring herself to take them off. He had always said he wanted to be buried in his boots. She hadn't known until that morning that he'd meant it literally. Thomas Dawson had been 34 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet in the way that strong men sometimes are when they've spent more years talking to cattle than to people. He had built the ranch with Clara, the two of them raising walls and digging fence posts from the spring of 1882 until the place finally looked like something that would last. He had taught Clara to ride before they were married, taught her to shoot the winter after. When a mountain lion took one of their calves and she realized that knowing how to ask for help was not the same as knowing what to do when help was 2 days away. He taught her to read the land, to watch where the grass bent, and know which way the herd had drifted. He taught her everything he knew, not because he expected to die, but because he believed that a woman who couldn't survive alone wasn't free. He died on a Monday in January. His horse hit a patch of black ice crossing the North Ridge and went down hard. Thomas hit the frozen ground head first. The horse got up. Thomas didn't. Clara found him at dusk when the horse came back to the barn without him. She rode out with a lantern and found his body on the ridge, already cold, the frost already forming on his mustache. She loaded him onto his horse and led him home in the dark. And she didn't cry because there was too much to do, and crying required a kind of stillness she couldn't afford. They buried him Tuesday morning. The neighbor men came from the Harlan spread 6 miles east, dug the grave, lowered Thomas in, and stood with their hats off while Clara read from the Book of Psalms. The words came out of her mouth in white clouds that the wind tore apart as fast as she could speak them. When it was done, the men filled the hole and asked if she needed anything. "I need you to go home," Clara said. "I have cattle to feed." She fed the cattle that afternoon. She broke the ice on the water trough with a sledgehammer. She counted heads and found 63 where there should have been 65. 2 heifers missing from the south pasture. She noted it the way Thomas would have noted it, in the small leather book he kept on the shelf by the door, the one with all the numbers and dates and tallies that made a ranch a living thing instead of just a piece of dirt. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the rifle across her knees and the leather book open in front of her, and she did the arithmetic of survival. 160 acres. 63 head of cattle, maybe 61 if the missing heifers didn't come back, a root cellar with enough salt pork, dried beans and flour to last until April, $12 in the coffee tin above the stove, no husband, no children, no hired hand. The nearest town was Lander, 18 miles south, and the nearest law was in the territorial seat. 2 hard days by horse. She picked up the rifle. It was a Winchester model, 1873, lever action, the stock worn smooth where Thomas's hands had held it for 5 years. It smelled like gun oil and cold metal. She worked the lever once, heard the round chamber, and set it on the table with the barrel pointed at the door. Clara Dawson was 31 years old, and she was alone on a ranch in Wyoming Territory in the dead of winter, and the only thing between her cattle and whoever was taking them was herself. The tracks told the story before anyone had to speak it. She found them the next morning in the south pasture. 3 sets of horse prints coming in from the tree line, circling the herd, and leaving with the 2 missing heifers. The prints were shod, which meant these weren't wild horses or Indians. These were men with saddles and shoes on their animals, and a plan to take what wasn't theirs. Clara followed the tracks for 2 miles into the timber before the snow covered them. She turned back and rode to Samuel Ironcloud's camp on the creek. Samuel was sitting outside his shelter mending a bridle when she rode up. He was a Shoshone horse trader who had been in the valley longer than any of the white ranchers. A man in his 50s with long, gray-streaked black hair and the kind of patience that comes from watching generations of people come and go across land that was never really theirs to claim. He traded horses with the ranchers and kept to himself, and in 5 years of being neighbors, he and Thomas had built the kind of respect that doesn't need many words. He looked at Clara on her horse. He looked at the rifle in her scabbard. He didn't ask about Thomas because he already knew. News moved through the valley the way cold moved through the mountains, slowly and completely. 3 riders took 2 of my heifers, Clara said. Came from the northwest timber. Samuel nodded. Jessup's outfit. They hit the Morrison place last month. Took 6 head. Morrison didn't do anything about it because Morrison has 4 children and 1 gun and no taste for dying. How many men does Jessup have? 3, counting himself. They camp on the far side of the range in winter. Come down when they need beef. Clara looked toward the mountains. Will they come back? They always come back. A ranch with no man on it is an easy mark. They'll take more next time, and more after that, until you have nothing left or until you leave. Clara sat quiet on her horse for a long time. The creek made a sound like glass breaking. The wind moved through the pines. I'm not leaving, she said. Samuel looked at her the way he looked at a horse he was deciding whether to buy, measuring something that couldn't be measured with a tape or a scale. Then he reached into his shelter and brought out a bundle of rawhide strips and a small pouch. Caltrops, he said. Scatter them on the trail where the timber meets your south pasture. They'll lame a horse faster than a gopher hole. He set the pouch on a rock. I'll keep my ears open. When they come, I'll send smoke. She rode home and spent the rest of the day preparing. She strung a line of tin cans across the south fence, the kind that would rattle in the wind but scream if a horse brushed against them. She moved the herd to the north pasture, closer to the cabin, where she could see them from the window. She loaded every weapon in the house, Thomas's Winchester, the shotgun that hung above the door, the Colt revolver he kept in the nightstand drawer, the one she had never fired but now carried on her hip in a holster that was too big and had to be cinched with an extra strip of leather. She practiced with the Winchester every evening for a week. She set up fence posts with old flour sacks nailed to them and fired until her shoulder was bruised purple and her aim was steady enough to hit a sack at 100 yards 3 times out of 5. Not perfect, but Thomas had told her once that in a real fight, the person who wins is not the best shot, but the one who doesn't panic. Clara was many things in those frozen January weeks, but she was not panicked. She was furious. Furious at the ground for being frozen. Furious at the horse for falling. Furious at Thomas for dying and leaving her to hold together a world they had built for 2. And furious at the men who looked at her ranch and saw weakness instead of a woman who had dug fence posts in July heat and pulled calves in March mud and slept with a rifle for 5 winters before this one. The anger kept her warm. It kept her moving. It kept her feeding the cattle at dawn and mending the fence at noon and sitting in the dark with the Winchester across her lap, watching the south tree line for shapes that didn't belong. They came on a Thursday night 3 weeks after Thomas died. She heard the tin cans first, a sound like a broken bell ringing in the dark, sharp and wrong. Clara was already dressed, already booted, already holding the Winchester. She blew out the lamp and moved to the window. The moon was half full, enough to see by. and she could make out 3 riders at the far edge of the south pasture, moving slow toward the herd. She pulled on Thomas's coat, stepped out the back door, and circled through the barn to the corral, where she had a clear line of sight to the pasture. She rested the Winchester on the top rail, steadied her breathing the way Thomas had taught her, and waited. The riders got closer. She could hear the creak of saddle leather, the soft blow of horses breathing in the cold. They were maybe 80 yards out, moving toward the cattle in a loose line, confident in the way that men are confident when they've done something 5 times without consequence and expect the 6th to be the same. Clara fired the first shot into the dirt 10 feet in front of the lead rider's horse. The sound split the valley open. The horse reared. The rider cursed and grabbed the saddle horn. The other 2 horses spooked sideways, and in the confusion, Clara worked the lever and fired again, this time into the air, and then a 3rd time into the ground near the second rider. She didn't aim at the men. She didn't want to kill anyone. She wanted them to know that the ranch they had marked as easy was not easy anymore. "Next one goes through a saddle," she shouted into the dark, and her voice carried across the frozen pasture with a clarity that surprised even her. "Get off my land." There was a moment of silence. Then one of the riders, the one in the long duster, the one she knew must be Jessup, turned his horse and looked toward the corral where the muzzle flash had been. She couldn't see his face. She could feel him calculating. She fired a 4th shot. This one kicked up frozen dirt close enough to Jessup's horse to make it dance sideways. The 3 riders turned and rode back into the timber. She listened to the hoofbeats fade until there was nothing but wind and the sound of cattle shifting nervously in the dark. Clara stood at the corral fence for another hour, the Winchester warm in her hands, her breath coming in fast white clouds, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. When she was sure they were gone, she went inside, locked the door, sat down at the kitchen table, and shook for 20 minutes straight. Then she reloaded the rifle and went back to the window. They didn't come back that night, or the next, or the one after that. The first morning after, Clara walked the pasture and found what they had left behind: cigarette stubs near the tree line where they had waited before approaching, a piece of rope that had been used to hobble a horse, boot prints in the snow, size 11 or 12, deep enough to belong to heavy men who were used to taking things from people who couldn't stop them. She collected all of it the way Thomas would have. Evidence, proof that the world had come to her door and she had sent it back. But Clara knew they would return. Men like Jessup didn't stop because they were scared. They stopped because they were recalculating. She had surprised them. Next time they would be ready. The nights were the hardest, not because of the cold or the dark or the rifle across her knees, because of the silence. Thomas had been a quiet man, but even quiet men fill a house. The sound of his boots on the floor, the creak of his chair by the fire, the way he would hum under his breath while cleaning his rifle, a hymn his mother had taught him that Clara had never learned the words to, but could still hear in her head if she closed her eyes. The cabin was full of him and empty of him at the same time, and every night she sat at that table, she was fighting 2 wars, one against the men in the timber, and one against the grief that sat in the chair across from her and wouldn't leave. She rode to Ironcloud's camp the next morning. He had heard the shots. She told him what happened, and he listened without expression. And when she was finished, he said, "You bought yourself a week, maybe 2. He'll come back with a plan." "Then I need a better plan than his?" Samuel looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up and said, "Come with me." He took her into the timber to a place where the trail from the northwest narrowed between 2 rock outcrops, a natural bottleneck that any rider coming from Jessup's camp would have to pass through. He showed her where to position herself above the trail, where the rocks provided cover, and the angle gave her a clear view of anyone approaching for 200 yards. He showed her where to scatter the caltrops so the horses would hit them before the riders even knew they were in a trap. "You don't have to shoot 'em," Samuel said. "You just have to make it cost more to come here than the cattle are worth." Clara set up the bottleneck over the next 3 days. She hauled rocks to build a low wall she could shoot from. She scattered the caltrops across the trail. She cut branches to break up her silhouette. And she waited. Jessup came back on a Sunday, just before dawn. She heard the horse scream first, a high, sharp sound that echoed off the rocks, and then the cursing, and then the chaos of men trying to control animals that had stepped on something that bit through the hoof. Clara fired from the rocks, one shot in front of them, one shot behind them, penned between the outcrops with a lame horse and gunfire from above. Jessup and his 2 men had exactly 2 choices: forward into more caltrops and a rifle they couldn't see, or back the way they came. Jessup chose back, but before he turned his horse, he shouted up at the rocks, his voice tight with rage and something that might have been grudging respect. "Who the hell are you?" Clara didn't answer. She let the Winchester answer for her. One more shot ringing off the stone walls of the bottleneck, and the 3 riders disappeared back into the timber. She stayed behind the rocks until the sun was fully up and the birds had started again, because Thomas had told her once that birds go quiet when danger is near and don't start again until it's truly gone. When the jays started screaming at each other in the pines, she climbed down and checked the trail. Blood on the ground where a horse had stepped on a caltrop. A hat that one of the riders had lost in the scramble. A flat-crowned thing with a sweat-stained band. She hung it on a fence post at the edge of her property, where anyone riding in from the northwest would see it and understand what it meant. They never came back. Word spread through the valley the way everything spread, slowly and then all at once. The widow on the Dawson place had run off Jessup's outfit, alone, in the dark, with her dead husband's rifle and a line of tin cans on a fence. The ranchers came by one at a time over the following weeks. Tom Harlan brought a side of smoked elk and stayed to help her mend the north fence. Ed Morrison, the man with 4 children and 1 gun, brought his oldest son, and they spent 2 days fixing her barn roof where the snow weight had cracked a beam. A woman named Ruth Kincaid, who ran a boarding house in Lander, rode 18 miles to bring Clara a bolt of wool fabric and a letter from the territorial marshal saying that Jessup's outfit had been spotted heading south toward Colorado and were not expected back. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table where she had sat with the rifle so many nights. She folded it and put it in the leather book next to Thomas's last entry, a note about the 2 heifers he had counted on January 10th, 2 days before he died. Samuel Ironcloud came by in late February. He brought a young mare he said was too stubborn for anyone else. Clara said she didn't need another horse. Samuel said the horse didn't need another owner, so they were even. He tied the mare to the corral fence and rode away before Clara could argue. Spring came the way it always came to Wyoming, late and grudging, the snow pulling back in patches to reveal mud and then grass and then the first green shoots that meant the land was breathing again. The creek thawed and ran high with snowmelt, and the sound of it reached the cabin for the first time since November, a low, steady rush that Thomas had always said was the ranch telling them it was alive. Clara turned the cattle out to the south pasture and stood at the fence, watching them spread across the grass. 63 head, the same number she'd had the day Thomas died. She hadn't lost a single one. Every heifer, every steer, every stubborn old cow that had given her trouble at the water trough through the worst weeks of January, all of them still here, all of them hers. She took off her hat and let the wind pull at her hair, the long auburn braid coming loose the way it always did when the weather turned warm. She looked at the cabin Thomas had built, at the barn they had raised together, at the corrals and the fences and the chimney that still drew clean after 5 winters. She looked at the flat-crowned hat still hanging on the fence post where she had put it in February, bleached now by sun and snow, a scarecrow for the kind of men who measure a ranch by who's standing on it instead of what it's made of. She looked at the grave on the hill where the wooden cross stood crooked against the sky because the ground had heaved during the thaw, and she hadn't straightened it yet. Ruth Kincaid had told her, the day she brought the wool fabric, that people in Lander were talking about her, the widow who ran off the Jessup gang. Some of them said she was brave. Some of them said she was foolish. Clara didn't care what they called her. Thomas had taught her a long time ago that what people call you and what you are don't have to be the same thing. She would straighten it tomorrow. Today, she had cattle to move and fences to check and a young mare to break and a ranch to run. A ranch that was hers now, not because Thomas had left it to her, but because she had held it when everything and everyone had tried to take it away. Clara Dawson picked up the Winchester, slid it into the scabbard on her saddle, and rode out to check the south fence line. The sun was warm on her back. The mountains were still white at the peaks but greening at the base. The mare followed her without being led, stubborn and sure-footed, the way good things in Wyoming always were. Behind her, on the kitchen shelf, the leather book lay open to a new page. Clara's handwriting now, not Thomas's. The date, the head count, the weather, the slow, careful arithmetic of a woman who had buried her husband on a Monday and picked up his rifle on a Tuesday and taught every man in the territory that the Dawson Ranch was not a place you came to take from. It was a place that would stand.